So this is session 2 of Who is in Charge, and I'm calling this one the Red Sea. Yesterday we saw how God dismantled the Egyptian religion and showed that he was the only one true God. Now the Egyptians gave in and they let the Hebrew people go, and the Hebrew people gathered all their belongings and left. So surely this was enough for the Egyptians to realise they had no power, and the Hebrew people to know that God had just done amazing things to rescue them from slavery. We read that the Hebrew people didn't go directly up the the west coast, because that would have gone through hostile Philistine territory. But rather God sent them south towards the Red Sea, which then would have been a barrier between them getting to go north. In a very short time, both the Egyptians and the Hebrews seemed to forget the lesson they'd just learned. The Egyptians suddenly realised that they'd just lost their cheap labour force, and so Pharaoh sent the whole Egyptian army out after the Hebrew people. And the Hebrews camped on the shore of the Red Sea, and they saw an army coming after them, and they began to turn on Moses. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. The Egyptians forgot what God had shown them when they realised the cost to their economy, and the Hebrews forgot when they saw what they thought was an impossible situation. So God had to act again. This time he ordered Moses to hold his rod across the water, and as he did, a wind came up from the east and blew back the water so that the Hebrew people could walk across on dry ground. The Egyptian army followed, but the wheels of the chariots got stuck in sand, and when all the Hebrew people were across, God told Moses to hold up his rod again, and the waters came back, and the whole Egyptian army was drowned. Now, surely this time the Hebrew people would realise that God was God and on their side. And yes, they did. They sang and they danced and they praised God in their song. But it only lasted 3 days. In another 3 days, they're grumbling again against Moses. Makes you wonder how they could be so petulant. Why couldn't they just rejoice in their freedom? One reason is that these people had been slaves for generations, and while their work was hard, they didn't have to think about what they had to do. They were just told and they just did it. And they also had their food provided, so they didn't have to work to provide food for themselves. So although they're physically free now, they would still be slaves in their thinking. And so God was going to take them to the promised land where everything would be provided for them. But he led them for 40 years. It was a journey that could have been done in 14 days. He led them for 40 years through the desert because he needed to teach them a lesson. And the lesson was that while they were in Egypt, then Pharaoh had provided everything for them. He was going to take them to the promised land where everything would be provided for them, but by him, not by Pharaoh. And so the time in the desert was to show them that he was completely trustworthy, because you can't provide for yourself in the desert. Much later, when they got to the promised land and they were settled there, they began to forget that lesson, and they began to think that they were doing this all themselves. And God would remind them from time to time, remember when I led you through the desert, and all the incidents where he had provided for them. We like to live as if we're in charge, as if we can be self-sufficient. The truth is that we too are completely dependent on God. Every now and then we might have an awesome experience of his providing for us. Maybe there's some money that's come unexpectedly and it enables us to pay a particular bill. And we praise God for that provision. But it's so easy to forget so quickly that God is there for us. Life is a journey of learning, and it's a journey of learning to trust that God is there for us.
will trust in you alone. For your endless mercy follows me, your goodness will lead me home. He guides my way in righteousness, and He anoints my head with oil, and my cup it overflows with joy. I feast on His pure delight, and I will trust